Welcome to the Speaking Podcast. You can find all our episodes on speakingpodcast.com. We're also on BitChute and YouTube as Speaking Podcast, and you find the links in the podcast description. We also have the Awakening Podcast, Learn Polish Podcast, Meditation Podcast, and the Crypto Podcast, and all can be found on roycollin.com. Today, my guest, looking forward to this very interesting character. Please welcome Paul Ruppert.
Hello, Roy. I guess I'm an interesting character. Okay. Pleasure to be here, and I look forward to having an exchange with you, and hopefully to the benefit of your audience. So
you might let the audience know who's Paul.
Wow. I've been in, let's say, commercially, the telecommunications mobile services business, otherwise known as CPaaS now, for communications platform as a service for a little over 20 years. And some of the things I've done are involved in product development, innovation harvesting, business development, commercial scaling. I've been involved in taking a true, what I would call cockroach startup, where I was employee number 12, and 5 years later we sold it for a little over $500 million. I've also pivoted from that to becoming a strategy consultant for the likes, in speaking specifically about text messaging. That's really what the space that I'm involved in. Being able to pivot from the startup environment, working inside a mobile network operator known as AT&T in the United States, as well as having clients that include MasterCard, Western Union, companies in my space, including Infobip, Cinch, SAP, and others. I also happen to have 2 patents in the space, and that's my private sector career. So I guess I'm somewhat of an ambidextrous executive in the context of I spent a career of 10 years in the public sector, including right out of college working for a United States senator as a legislative assistant, moving on to being a economic policy development advisor to a cabinet secretary, as well as being a trade association lobbyist, and then eventually doing work inside the George Herbert Walker Bush White House, 41 as he was called back then. So I straddle I straddle 2 different segments and have a wide range of expertise and multidisciplinary skills.
Great, very impressive. With the patents, did you go international or just in the States? Because I've been involved with a few people I know, and it's a long process.
Yes. So the quick answer to that is international. So I have a patent. The same patent is recognized by the EU as well as in the US. This company that I mentioned earlier, as I called it, this cockroach startup, the company was called Mobile 365. And when we came in, I came in as well as a few others to help out the founders. I arrived through the access point of a venture capitalist. I was the one who internationalized the business in the context of the VC, who I knew for many years. He was like, this is a company that doesn't recognize that there's a bigger market offshore from the United States than there is onshore. And the value proposition was we were taking text messages, SMS, that we all utilize today. But this was back in the early 2000s, 2001 to be specific. We were enabling text message to go from the native GSM radio format, which was a radio standard that was used primarily in Europe at that time, and be able to take this native capability, which is text messaging, 160 characters, and send it into non-native GSM radio format networks, i.e. CDMA, TDMA, IDEN, handy phone. These are all the various standards that were going on in the standards wars back then. GSM eventually prevailed, which is what we now know as 3G, 4G, 5G. So I had been in an operator in a job called the International Roaming Director before I left after 5 years of doing that. That was a job where I was negotiating B2B contracts between the mobile network operators all around the world and the one that employed me, which was AT&T based in California at the time. So I knew the impact of global telephony because the telecommunications business is essentially telecommunications network that we all utilize today is clearly probably the most complicated infrastructure and machine that man has ever created because it's constantly changing, it's everlasting living, and it's massive in its reach. It's easier to reach for a mobile phone in many parts of the world than it is to get fresh water or to find a toilet. That's the dynamic and the impact. And so back to your question, inside this cockroach startup, there were a few of us who had long-term strategies and looked over the horizon, which is a phrase I like to use, um, and recognized that this is a global play. So we've got to be able to look at this as a global opportunity, and that was my piece of the overall puzzle that I was able to contribute. And eventually, back to metrics. You know, metrics matter in the business world. If you keep score, you do more, so to speak. I owned, after 5 years, I drove about $62 million out of the $120 million in revenues that the company generated, which meant that most of the revenues were based offshore, were originated or flowing offshore than inside North America. So that's a long answer to your simplest, not simple, but your short question: international versus U.S. Well, both, and this is why. So sorry about that lengthy
No,
answer.
no, it was great. And just because I know that there's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen in as well, with the patents, like there's a lot of court cases, there's a lot of people copying. Is it worth kind of chasing them, or are you just running down the road and running out of money? Or can you take on a company, a legal company that will actually do it on a fee basis?
Of course, yeah. We were at a stage where we were past, trying to figure out if we were going to make payroll in 60 days. This is probably, we were up to maybe $10 million in revenue. So we had resources, and we even had a general counsel who had been involved in technology companies. But we all knew that it was accretive in the context of we had to do this because we wanted to be able to protect our IP, intellectual property resources. And we knew that there'd be a valuation payoff at some point in the future in the context of this is who we are, and we were disruptive using the language of Silicon Valley where I've worked in my past. Um, we were providing a disruptive solution or creating a disruptive solution. So we knew that we needed to do that. And in the end, by the time that we sold the company, I think we had about 14 patents that were distributed through the company by various members. I mean, I'm not a technically trained technologist. I don't have a undergraduate degree in electrical engineering or computer science or anything like that. But I learned the technology is being part of a product development team inside an operator. So even a guy like me with a political science degree and a master's degree in public administration can develop a patent. It's just a matter of you look at it and you got the right people going, yeah, here's the technical means that we can accomplish this, or this is why this is commercially different. Therefore, we should patent it, and therefore it will impact downstream.
And regarding, like, say, the speaking, both in the political field and the business, because I mean, there's plenty of times I presume you've been on stage with whatever business you've been involved. What have you learned over the years?
Well, let's say I was classically trained as a political operative. I used to run political campaigns and went through what I would call a combination boot camp, grad school, and job, where the Republican National Committee actually trained people back then. This was in the mid 80s, and I was in my mid 20s at the time. How to run political campaigns. So they had a program that developed skills for campaign managers. So, that would be like the CEO of a company, or finance people, which would be like the fundraisers, the venture capitalists of the political world, or media operatives. So they were providing the marketing and interface and the voice. So I got trained in the context of how to be able to write speeches, and then later on, when I was inside a cabinet secretary's office, how to be able to write testimony for congressional hearings. So then juxtapose that with later on, I've now done over 65 appearances at industry conferences in the last 23 years in the space that I've been in. So giving a speech in a public context is different and yet the same as making a business presentation within an audience. Audiences usually change, and sometimes in a public context, you're speaking beyond the audience that you may be in front of. Great example of that is like convention speeches or State of the Union speeches. Sure, there are 500 people in the audience or 600 people, but you're being broadcast to 100 million people who want to be able to listen to the speech or something along those lines. So there are different dynamics. It still works off, in my mind, a 3-act play structure, which is you gain the interest of the audience up front. You lay out the scenario. Act 2, you then get deeper into the imbalance, which is really going to be leading to Act 3, which is the rebalance and the call to action. I mean, that's the simplistic approach to it. And business presentations aren't that much different. The shared characteristics is storytelling. So you are taking the audience on a journey, and that journey is going to lead to an act of change. And acts of change can be painful sometimes. People can resist it. There's the status quo that may resist it. So you then have to be able to provide the emotional and the logical rationale to make that change, to make it compelling, to support that change in policy or to support that change in strategy in a business context or anything else. This is why you need these resources. So
Excellent. And I believe it's 80 countries that you've operated in. So what have you learned the difference between kind of being different parts of the world?
well, I'm definitely not your traditional American executive in the context of that I A, have a passport, and B, have gone to more places than just Canada or Mexico. But I was kind of genetically predisposed to all of this as a child. I happen to be half French. And my mother would return back to visit her family, her side of the family, and she would bring me along. And that started off when I was about 5 years old and continued on until I was 16, where I was kind of revolting. I was more interested in playing soccer for my high school soccer team in the summertime than going to Europe and seeing the same family members again and again. So I had that advantage because she turned it into a grand tour. By the time that I was probably around 14 or 15, I'm sure that I'd been to at least 10 countries. Um, so that gave me a different lens than most people have and had an exposure to a different culture, different language. And as a result of that, I think that's given me an advantage both in the political world in my first career, as well as certainly in my second career as an executive, a commercial executive. And most of that is having an understanding to learn more and more, learn as much as possible about my partner. Who's the partner? Well, the partner is if you're in a negotiation, and the negotiation is selling. And that's what my role has been, either carrying a bag as an individual salesman or running and building sales organizations on a global basis. So you have to have an understanding of where the other person is coming from. And that's based on conversation. And conversation is about listening. Listen more, talk less. Tell, don't sell. Those different adages. That's kind of the approach that I've always taken. And I also have a personality. It was once pointed out to me by an HR specialist, and she she mentioned that I had a proclivity and an intense need to be problem solving, which is why I like to travel so much. And I was like, okay, I don't see the connection. What, make the bridge for me here. I didn't see it. So look, you enjoy that problem solving piece, and when you get off a plane in a new destination, you have to be problem solving from moment one because you have no experience in that space, in that arena. You don't even know where you're going. So you're immediately trying to either follow the plan that you may have established, or you have to be agile enough to see the changing dynamics in front of you. You may have thought that you're going to be picked up by a driver, or you may have thought that you'd be able to catch a cab, but then you're inundated with drivers who are trying to rip you off, or a weather event, or a failure of something in the system that you thought you were going to be relying upon, and you've got to be able to adapt. Friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, was a United States Marine Corps officer, and he always talks about adapt or die. So
Very good. And building a, say, sales team, then would you use any of the kind of like disc profiling or these other systems to find the best people, or what was your strategy on that?
oh, to be honest, no. To all of the above. Keep in mind that my 10 years in the political realm enabled me to read people and develop a skill of being able to interact with people. One of the jobs I had when I was in the political world is called a political advance man. And this is pretty obscure, but they're pretty important roles. So when you have somebody like a cabinet secretary, the vice president, or the president of the United States, or other foreign dignitaries, come and to do an event, especially if you're doing multiple events, like in a massive national campaign, there are teams of people who come in like 3 days before, and they're called the advance team. And the advance team usually is like 4 or 5 people, and it's run by one individual who is ultimately responsible for all the logistical and activity of the principal, meaning, as I mentioned, cabinet secretary, president, vice president, etc., from the time they deplane a plane to the time that they get on the next plane. So it might be 2 hours, it might be 3 events, it might be 5 events, and you have to break that down moment by moment by moment. And in that job, you oversee interfacing with security, with finance, with protocol, all that good stuff. So you get used to dealing with lots of different people, which goes to your question, which my answer is I work off my gut in the context of, first off, they got to be part of my team. And I'm not trying to create a team under a command and control context, but I know I need an asset, that a resource to fill an opportunity or create an opportunity with that individual. And I look to those kind of conversations, and it doesn't take, for me, I've gone into Singapore and had working with a recruiter where we interviewed about 15 people for a regional sales lead, a significant role. And we did that over the course of 3 days. And most of the time I was talking to people for an hour and a half at least at beginning. No screening call from HR, none of the other baloney engagements, as I would call it, because my perspective is I got to do this fast. So we're going to move it through. And I can't say that in my experience of hiring or firing people, I've never misread someone so blatantly that it was like, man, what a screw up. So I got to go back to my systems. Whether it's I'm an ENTJ, Myers-Briggs, which is this kind of stuff that I saw as a kid. Now, as a rising executive, that doesn't diminish the impact of those. If you feel that you have to do that, that's fine. Personally, I didn't, and it wasn't me making, like I say, a dictatorial decision. It was myself and others on the team, if it was a significant person, obviously, or a significant role, they'd be talking with the likes of maybe a board member or maybe the CEO, as well as myself, as well as peers. And I even threw in people that, used to have sales engineers that might be 2 levels below a regional sales lead that I might be hiring. And in this case, I'm working off one real live person that I hired, and he ended up working me for 5 years. And then when I left the company, we stayed in the company for another 3 years, and now he's a big sales guy with about a $750 million P&L. But I hired him in 2005 to run Hong Kong, and he built it out from there. Point being that you do a 360-degree evaluation, but at the end of the day, if the buck stopped with me, as many times it has, I made that call. So
I mean, I've hired a lot over the years, and I know that my gut was always the one, but there was a few
yeah,
things I did is I'd always ask the receptionist because
what's
sometimes
your
they let,
call?
yeah, because they
Yeah,
let their guard down. And another
that's
time
right.
I might take them for lunch and just see how they interact with waiters. And you can,
Oh, you got it. Yeah. And I have been a waiter, I was a waiter when I was in college and when I first moved to Washington, D.C. before I had my job. And oddly enough, there were even people that I ended up working with on Capitol Hill that I once waited on, that I recognized them. And then I introduced myself and they were like, oh, oh yeah, I remember. And oh, now you work for Senator Danforth? I'm like, yeah. So, that very clear indicators. And back to the receptionist, that too is, um, what is their decorum? How sociable are they? Do they ask a question? Hey, how long have you worked here? Do you like working here? You probably see everybody. What's the good and the bad? And a good receptionist is not going to give anything away. And that's also based on your judgment. Did you hire the right person to be the receptionist? So spot
uh,
on. You got it on that one.
and I think as well, I mean, you mentioned, being a waiter. I think our journey in life with the little jobs that we do, that, as we're growing, I used to do newspapers, cut grass and everything, but you're learning skills the whole time. And it's
That's
later
right.
you realize, oh, it's this reason why I'm good at this.
Well, to bring it back to the title of your podcast, not that I want to Shanghai the control of the controller, but I as the side gig that is now being labeled on, what's your side gig? I happen to be a ski instructor for about the last 20 years, off and on for the last few years, but for fairly intensely at the beginning, part time. And so the reality of that was, I used to joke that to be a ski instructor, you're trained more than a radiologist technician, because primarily of liability issues, but there are things that you have to be able to understand: educational teaching theory. You've got to have the physical capacity to be able to perform the movement. I mean, almost like a ballet, because the movement has to be uniform. That's how you get the certification by the Professional Ski Instructors of America, which is all part of a global initiative to be able to teach the same thing, whether you are in Chamonix, France, or whether you are in Colorado. And so to go through that process, that's also about public speaking. And there too there's a degree of entertainment involved. There's a degree of coaching. I used to say that, yeah, I take fear and anxiety and turn it into exhilaration and fun, just in the course of 90 minutes, even with never evers who may never have been on board skis before. Um, and that journey, that, as a ski instructor, is the same kind of journey as a speaker that you take. And there too, there are all kinds of little tricks, as we would say, uh, the tricks in your kit that you pull out, the little things along the way. I mean, one I learned early on, which is again germane to, forgive me, professor, to the class at the moment. I remember being in an examination. So you get it's like any class. So you're teaching a class And I remember once where I was going through a sequence of events because, much like math, skiing is going about edge, rotation, and pressure, and what you're doing to be able to manifest edge, rotation, and pressure on your skis. And I had gotten a sequence mixed up, just one of like 4 different sequences. And I apologized. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I missed something. I got to, this is what's going on." And then at the end of the examination, one of the examiners, a guy who's, like a skiing god, really, truly part of the industry. And I was just, a part timer. He said, "You don't need to apologize because the audience has no idea what you're going to be talking about. So you may have caught it. And you also were in the examination environment, which we understand, but you didn't need to do that. So I'm going to have to hit you on that one." Meaning he was taking points away because I was being polite, but I didn't need to point out, "Oh, I missed something." Okay. And you can just let it flow. Same thing, and part of that is recognition of the value of the audience. Come prepared and be flexible relative to changing conditions. So,
And I think on that as well, so many people, they beat themselves up because they plan to say a certain thing, especially the guys that speak from the heart but don't, might have bullet points and they miss one of them. Nobody ever knew, so there's no point in beating yourself up.
yeah, yeah. And again, even in the political context, a lot of people don't often recognize this, but what you see on a let's say a 15-second soundbite on the nightly news of a politician during a political campaign, he's given that same speech 5 times that day. Or in interviews, he's covering the same topic maybe 3 times that day. So there are some manifestation of change, based on the audience, but consistently, the good ones just stick to it, go and that's also a reflection of the good ones that they've got this ability. And I saw this many times. As soon as the red light would go on, bam, they had a completely different persona and they were focused on exactly what they had to perform, as opposed to others who are like, "Yeah, I'll wing it." You're not going to wing it because it's going to come through that you're winging it. And that's also, again, back to my belief, that's being disrespectful of the audience because they're here to hear something from you. Back to, fear turning into fun. In the same respect, it's like, yeah, I'm here because I want to hear what you have to say, change my mind, or I don't really agree with you, but I'll listen. Well, in the old days, American politics doesn't fall into that category any longer. But back in the old days, when I was a young guy, it was a different dynamic. So you get the idea. Professor, sorry about that.
And I know you've been involved at mergers and acquisitions, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, sometimes the cultures don't. What's been your experience in kind of knowing when it'll work?
Well, how you engage. So I started getting involved in M&A as one of the business unit leads. So I was in a company, a very large, it's now owned by the Carlyle Group, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. And we had a guy who just was his job, and he wasn't called corporate development, um, but he was essentially the M&A leader, and he had been a former banker for Bank of America. And what he did was he would look at, let's say, the statistics, the performance metrics, or he would hear some things, and he would say, "Hey, I want you to look at Acme messaging." And being the business lead, I'm like, "Sure. Okay. So what do you want me to look for?" Engage them. Here's what we think we'd like to do with them. I see this opportunity and how they might tuck in or fit into our objective relative to markets or technology or whatever else, talent, etc. Or we just want to buy their revenues and we're going to flush everybody out, whatever it might be. So start putting that in your crosshairs and start engaging them if we're not already engaged, whether they're a partner or whether they are a business partner or a supplier or vendor, whatever it might be. And as the first time I asked him, "So Bill, why don't you want me to do this? Why do you want me to do this?" And then he would say, "Because if I roll in with a corporate development card name, on my business card, everybody's going to kind of quote lawyer up. You're not going to get what you want to see, but you can have that relationship And at first, they may not have any sense of why you're investigating all this, but you'll get a better sense. And I want your perspective, not just my perspective. Meaning, he wanted to have a business perspective. So that's the first thing. Don't let corporate development always ride over the objectives and the vision and the perspectives of those people who are actually running the business in the trenches. And then, I've done due diligence now as a consultant on a number of different deals, about a dozen of them or so. And I regularly have conversations with what I would call the financials, meaning associates or bankers who are looking at a space, specifically my space, trying to get more insight. So it's do your homework, and do your homework on a number of different levels. And as you start to progress through the conversation, beyond, yes, we'd like to have a conversation with you, there's consideration that we might even acquire you. What's your perspective on that? Because at some point that question has to be asked. Otherwise, it's going to be a hostile takeover, and that becomes a different kettle of fish entirely. But if you start progressing through that, that's when you've got to be very observant. Back to like the receptionist conversation. Where are you picking up information from? Whether it's open source information, meaning what you can get off the internet and doing the usual stuff, especially publicly traded companies, is really easily. Privately held companies, then it's all reputational. And you start looking at their ecosystem. And if you get to the point where you're looking at their balance sheets, their vendors, etc., go to the vendors, start asking them. So, what's it like working with Acme Messaging? How long have you been doing this? Why are you guys asking? Well, we're in conversations with them, trying to figure out how we might be able to work together. And our approach is we'd like to get, again, that 360-degree view and perspective of it. And, it's almost like an intelligence gathering, intelligence as in CIA or MI5 or MI6. You're trying to pull information from all the different perspectives, and you've got the analyst team and you have the operational team. Everybody comes together, and then recognizes, yes, we should make this deal, and plus the financial team in terms of, is this viable in the long term? And then the other piece is, which is really critical, because I've been involved in what's called two PMIs, post-merger integrations. You have to be looking at that from the beginning. Okay, so if you are, let's say, Airbnb, and you're thinking about acquiring IBM, how much more dissimilar could it be? But if you think there's an opportunity where you can blend these two together and make you even better, that new co, as it's called, that new company, go for it. But if not, then walk away.
Excellent. No, I love
Best
it.
alternative to your negotiated agreement, your BATNA point, to use the vernacular of negotiations. But yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. And when you're, say, working with a company that's going international, and you're dealing with different currencies, like, what's the best way of doing it? I know you can fix a currency if you think you're going to do something over 2 years or whatever, but regarding a currency spread, that if you're selling something and it moves and you've agreed a certain price, have you had that kind of situation?
Yeah. So back to the cockroach startup environment. Back, and again, this was about 1 year into the company's development where I got pulled in. They were just about to get a fair amount of first round funding from a venture capitalist. And I was talking about, you've got to go global from the start. And here's why. The network effects relative to the telecommunications business, the network effects relative to the messaging piece, etc. So as I start to put the contracts in place, we limited our currency exposure to 4 currencies. So as I recall, euro, dollars, pounds, Singaporean dollars. I think that was the 4 that we looked at. I don't think we did yen out of Japan. No, because in the messaging business, there wasn't much stuff going on relative to Japan. So the Singaporean dollars was a compromise for those Asian customers that we were going after that may not have been willing to do exchange in dollars. But US dollar is a currency of record in all instances. So I probably could have just as easily said it's just US dollars, but that would have made things a little bit more inconvenient for Europeans. And we knew that Europe was going to be a major um, source of revenue for us. So that's why we had that adaptability. So my exposure, and this was, working out with the chief financial officer's office, but our exposure was fairly minimal because those currencies don't have huge fluctuation or anything else. There are other elements that we had to consider because in China, for example, in mainland China, you can't really expatriate revenues and profits. You got to keep them in country. Same thing in Brazil. So you have to establish a wholly owned foreign entity in both of those regions. And that becomes a different conversation in the context of, all right, if we take off, if this becomes highly successful, what are we going to do with our profits in country? So, and then it becomes part of your overall valuation, sure, but it's just not something that you can kind of pluck out and seamlessly plug into your cash flow on a global basis. It's not that you can't take it out, it just becomes there's a cost associated with taking that out, taxes and things of that nature.
Very interesting. And finally, I think you're an avid reader like myself. I'm just curious, have you wrote a book or are you planning on writing a book? Because I like your explanation of all the different questions that I've given you.
My father was a lawyer, and my grandfather was a sharecropper, a farmer, um, and didn't have the benefit of going to college or anything like that. But he wrote a book. My father wrote a book, and he wrote his book when I was going to sleep at night when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. And he wrote a book essentially about his exploits in World War II, and then afterwards, because he was a junior prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crime trials. And he never got the book published, but I still have the book, and I even have a copy of my grandfather's text there too. Oddly enough, I have an uncle who was 25 years younger than my father. They were like the bookends in a 10-child family. And unfortunately, some didn't even get through 12 years old. It was just the nature of when they were born. And my uncle has written 2 books. His name is Jack Ruppert. And he wrote a book about his time in officer candidate school as a U.S. Marine Corps officer. So that was part of his training. That's a long answer to the following, which is I have this feeling that I have to write a book, but I've never thought that I could discipline myself until one of your former guests, who happens to be a good friend of mine, a guy named Graham Brown. And to the audience, if you haven't had the chance to listen to Roy and Graham have a conversation, go back, listen to Graham. Graham is somebody I've known for about 15 years, and he's kind of getting me into podcasting as a guest, which is how you and I kind of connected indirectly. And he's advocating that I should write an ebook because of all things, 14 years ago, I actually wrote a blog about the mobile telecommunications business. And those of you who are interested, you can go back and find that at www.mobilepointview.com. Now, keep in mind, that's around 4 years of blogs, postings that stopped 10 years ago. Or you can go to more recent entries on my website, but completely different. I stopped blogging because it's like a shark. And so people who've written a book, there's a lot of discipline, a lot of work goes into writing a right and proper manifest. But Graham is trying to tell me, no, you could write like a 40-page ebook all about CPaaS because you're already talking about these things. So we might as well just take what you're talking about, like a conversation from a podcast, repurpose it. You could then rebuild it from there and outline that, and you could probably put together 40 pages maybe in a month. And oddly enough, I don't know if are you a member of Lunch Club by chance,
I am,
Roy?
yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So to the audience, to those of you who don't know what Lunch Club is, and you can opine on this as well, it's a networking club that is all based on virtual conversations that are very short. And originally, from what I understand, it's based on actual face-to-face meetings pre-COVID. But once COVID developed, they shifted their model. And I've discovered even one guy who in Lunch Club, in being, you put in your profile, it's very much like LinkedIn. And then the algorithm presents people, whether you'd like to meet them, but you're never really choosing who you're meeting. The algorithm presents itself to you. So it may have presented, would you like to meet someone like Roy Coughlin? And then it would give a description of Roy, and you say yes or no, and you hit yes, but I'm never really connecting with Roy via the algorithm. So I might meet, like a doppelganger. What do they call it? Doppelganger? Yeah, doppelganger of Roy,
Doppelganger.
which may be like Graham Brown, who's a podcast host, well, etc. And then I have a conversation with Graham. So the dynamic there, I'm leading to the following, which is I was talking to a guy who's a ghostwriter, and he happens to be out of France, and he had a great story of his own coming out of South Africa. And he was like, you should write a book. I could probably help you write a book. And he wasn't trying to sell his services, because we were chatting about this, and because I was asking him about how he did his work. And that's when he said, just the story that you've woven through here in our conversation, that would be an easy pivot. So you should give that some thought. So Roy, the fact that we're voicing this, I'm in the back of my mind, I've been thinking, what am I going to do for the next 2 weeks in terms of the holidays? And so, it's one of those things as to, yeah, let's take a run at this. Let's see if we can put something together and see how far we can go with it.
Your New Year's resolution, get that book out.
Yeah, yeah. And this other guy, his name is Andy Mack. Andy was saying, look, because again, we were talking about just chit chat, but it's interesting how deep you can go with a complete stranger, like now. Okay, the I was telling him, because we were talking early in the morning, and he was in France, so it was really early for me. And it's like, you're up really early at 5 a.m. to have a conversation with a complete stranger. And I'm like, well, I get up at 4, so this I'm already into my day. And that's when he came back to when we started talking about the discussion of writing a book. He said, just take that hour and shut everything down, and then write in a journal. Or you could, instead of writing chapters, write like segments. So, back to the 80 countries, he was saying you could write a book on that. Just take one country, go back to your memory, and that morning write about that country. So in 3 months, you've got everything. You've got the entire text laid out, and then work from there. It's like, wow, no wonder you do what you do. So
Excellent. Yeah. So I
So,
look. You
Roy,
have.
what are you what are you reading right now? I'm gonna take control of the mic here instead of you asking me the question. So, what are you reading these days after that conversation about books?
I've just finished the Sovereign, the System by and I'm interviewing him in a minute.
Okay.
So he's basically just kind of talking about all that's going on in the world and how to get your sovereignty. And so I'm kind of, he breaks it down. He talks about everything, every single thing, but in little chapters. And I like that, most of the stuff I knew, but I just like the way that he structured it.
Okay.
I've read a load of Judge Anna von Reitz. I like to read health books. I'm currently reading one. I'm nearly finished
Okay.
this. What Really Makes You Ill. Fantastic book. Just makes you think differently. And I'm
Okay.
the kind, I'll read something, and just because I've read it doesn't mean that I believe it. I'll then
Okay.
go, this is interesting, and I'll research further and further.
Right.
But
So you're a
I
true intellectual. Do you read multiple books at the same time,
Yeah,
or
I
just
do.
one book?
No, I found that I get through a lot more if I have maybe five on the go. And because I think sometimes you can have enough of a book, that you just absorb so much and you go, okay, that's enough for that one for today. And then you go on to another one. It works for me that way.
Very much the same. I have multiple books with different topics and different purposes. Um, right now, I'm reading a book called AI 2041 by an author named Kai-Fu Lee, who's quite well known in the artificial intelligence world. But this is what he's done, and I can't remember. He wrote it with another co-author. What they did was take a business analysis, business story, and science fiction relative to artificial intelligence and wrap it together, almost like a white paper. So you're reading a plot, and the plot is almost like a novel. Well, it is a novel. And it's the story of a family in 2041 and how they're interacting with an insurance company and how all the dynamics of that, including, and it's an Indian company, an Indian family, relative to caste, social position. So this is the exposition of how it's going to infiltrate our lives for the good and the bad. And meanwhile, you're learning all about the technology of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's really gripping in that context. You can read it as a story, but you can also read it as to, oh, so this is how this works. Ah, okay. Or this is going to be a manifestation of this type of technology. And why is this good? Where are the convenience factors to the consumers, meaning the protagonists in the story? And then what are the evil factors? Let's the corporate aspect of how can we extract more revenue from this, struggling middle class family in India, whatever it might be. It's a fascinating read. So
Excellent. No, I'll put that on my list. I
yeah,
always like to. Yeah.
Kai-Fu Lee is Kaifule.
Excellent, excellent. So listen, I know I must get you, once you get your book out, we'll get you back and we'll discuss that because I definitely would be something that I'd be interested in. But listen, Paul, really enjoyed talking with you. What's the best way people can get in contact with you?
You can reach me via LinkedIn. I'm listed as Paul R. Ruppert, or you can contact me via my website, which is www.globalpointview.com, or pruppert, P-R-U-P-P-E-R-T, at gpvltd.com.
Excellent. Yeah, perfect. I'll make sure I'll put all the links in the podcast description,
Thank you,
both
Roy.
on the audio and the video. So that's all for the Speaking Podcast. You can find all our episodes on speakingpodcast.com. As mentioned, we're on BitChute and YouTube. Be sure to give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends. Until next week, take care.
Thanks, Roy.